I'm Bill McWilliam, president of Cascadero Copper, CCD on the TSX Venture Exchange. Cesium is one of the world's rarest metals with a growing industrial demand. Drilling is underway on our Tehran property in Argentina to prove up a cesium resource. Cascadero's patent-pending leach process has the potential to make Cascadero the lowest cost supplier of cesium in the world. Visit our website, cascadero.com, or phone us at 604-924-5504.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com. He's also an editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he's worked and lived since 2004. Welcome back to the show, James.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jim.
I've seen a few headlines on the business news saying Kobe Steel scandal in Japan. Can you tell us what that scandal is all about and why people are so concerned about it?
Well, Kobe Steel is the third largest steel manufacturer in Japan, but it has a number of different business segments and products that it ranges into, including aluminum and copper products, aluminum can stock, aluminum sheet for heat exchangers, copper sheet and strip for semiconductors, those types of materials that are then used in parts for manufacturing of cars and airplanes and other things besides. And it was their aluminum and copper division that apparently was fabricating test data to indicate that these products had met certain safety qualifications when in fact they had failed those tests. They're just now revealing this, and apparently initially it was reported that this was just about some products that were certified over the course of the last year, but now there are executives coming out and saying, no, this is a deeper problem that's been going on for decades. So now they're starting to look at their entire range of products, and it's we still don't know the size or the scale of the problem, but there's some potentially pretty large problems involved with it. Some of the biggest manufacturers who are customers of Kobe Steel include General Motors and Ford and Boeing. And the latest story rolling off the headlines here in Japan is that now the scandal has spread to the bullet trains here in Japan, because the bullet trains use rolling stock that have tensile strengths that are actually below Japanese industrial standard specifications as a result of the fabricated data. So this is a very large problem that potentially affects a large number of customers, i.e. manufacturers, and then their customers, obviously. So, as I say, we're still sorting out how wide and how deep this scandal is, how many customers were affected. But once that starts to come into view, there is no doubt we're going to be seeing some pretty hefty lawsuits as a result of that. And unfortunately, we have no dearth of examples of these types of scandals in recent years that we can draw on to see how that kind of lawsuit process will unfold, including, of course, the Takata airbag scandal or the VW diesel scandal. So it's just a question of when and how big these lawsuits are going to be and whether Kobe Steel can survive it. And the type of insurance, as it were, for betting that Kobe Steel is going to be able to survive bankruptcy is the cost of that bet is going up. So it is a sign that the company itself may even be in trouble.
The Bank of Japan had been buying up shares in Japan's 50 biggest companies. If they were the third largest steel company, a lot of government-owned shares?
That's a good question. I don't know the percentage of government ownership. The government ownership was coming in the form of index purchases, not direct investment for the most part. So they do own a percentage of the stock market, as it were, but not necessarily ownership stakes in any of the companies. So I don't think it would have been a direct investment in that sense, but there's certainly the chance that BOJ money had funneled into Kobe Steel coffers in some form or other.
When you said it extends to GM and Boeing, what kind of products would it be? Brakes, safety items, your steering?
That's a good question. Again, I don't have that data directly. I think the manufacturers are still figuring out exactly what's been affected and how. But when and if it becomes a consumer scandal, I think we're going to hear about it. With regards to the bullet train scandal, they're saying that this does not affect passenger safety at this point. It's the affected parts span 2 categories and 310 components that are going to be replaced over the course of the next year during routine servicing of these bullet trains. But they do not expect that it poses any direct threat to passenger safety, although they would say that. But again, no word yet, as far as I know, about precisely what components have been affected with regards to Boeing or GM or these types of companies, and whether or not that poses a direct threat to consumers.
Are people in Japan expressing concerns about their safety on bullet trains because without them, the transportation system there would be pretty plugged up, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. The bullet train system is an extremely important part of the functioning of the transportation sector generally here. So it is a potentially very large thing. But this story is really only broken in the past 12 hours or so. So I think Japan, the bullet train story particularly. So I think we have yet to see whether this affects passengers or JR Japan Railway directly. At this point, no one is planning any boycotts or anything, but at any rate, it is a scandal that certainly could filter down to the consumer level like that.
Is there a possibility criminal charges would be laid because of the safety issues?
It certainly is a possibility. One would certainly think so, especially given that, again, this wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate falsification that, again, certain executives have intimated has been an ongoing systemic. One would think that in order to maintain any shred of credibility, the Japanese authorities would have to look into criminal charges in this case. And it is, this is the type of black eye that Japan really doesn't need right now, suffering through that Takata airbag scandal and recent scandals regarding Toyota safety. I think another major manufacturing industrial scandal here in Japan is certainly not what Japan Inc. needs. So perhaps to try to maintain credibility, if nothing else, some criminal charges will result from it.
Well, there used to be a time if something was made in Japan, if it was a Sony product and so on, it was always considered to be very high quality. Is Japan itself worried about their international reputation for quality?
You'll notice in a lot of the media that's covering this, the English language media, Bloomberg and elsewhere, they are taking that angle, that this is a black eye to the Japanese manufacturing sector in general, and sort of perhaps a hint of the decline of that status that Japan once enjoyed, and is perhaps being taken over by South Korea and other manufacturing bases now.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after the break.
Lotus Ventures Inc. is a BC-based medical marijuana company poised to launch into the rapidly evolving cannabis sector. Lotus is in the final review stage of the Health Canada approvals to become a licensed producer, having arranged facility financing of up to $12 million, plus building permits for its prototype indoor production facility. Shares trade under the symbol J on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Visit our website at lotusventures.ca.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp., RMO on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario, with grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold. A follow-up drill program to test the numerous targets located by recent groundwork will commence later this year. Please visit our website at rmroyalty.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, how's the Japanese stock market holding up, especially in light of the Kobe steel scandal?
Well, as I say, this is still a relatively new story, so I don't know if we've seen the effects of that on the stock market yet. But interestingly enough, we have seen in recent weeks the Nikkei stock average hitting an almost 21-year high, and that is primarily on a rise in Japanese auto stocks in the last few weeks. Apparently, the Japanese automotive sector is shaking off its worries that it's had since the beginning of the year and the new Trump presidency, some fears that there may be impact to Japan-U.S. trade. But now that those fears seem to be easing somewhat, it looks like the money is flooding back into Japanese stocks. And Toyota Motors, for example, share price bouncing back in recent weeks. So it does seem tentatively that Japanese stocks are taking off as a result of this. And longer term, one has to imagine that this is due to the sort of fundamental long-term outlook for the automotive sector that's happening in the wake of the idea of the electrification of cars and autonomous driving and these other things that are coming into view and that Toyota and other Japanese manufacturers are working on. So actually, Japanese stocks are looking up for a change.
Does it look like Japan will meet its goal of having robot taxis by the time they host the Olympics?
I imagine that since that story has been floated, they will, one way or another, have some service like that will function, at least for the cameras, and be the kind of story that that can be reported in the international press. Whether that will be a functioning fleet that will then be ready for daily service in Tokyo is another question altogether. And we do see these types of events, the expos and Olympics and other things like this, as more of a PR event. So I'm sure they'll have some sort of service available, but whether or not it will be really a functional service that will then be able to continue to be used is another question entirely. And there have been some scandals surrounding the preparations for the Olympics here recently. It's just been confirmed that one of the workers on the new Olympic stadium that they're constructing in Tokyo committed suicide after having worked something like 150 hours of overtime in a single month. Again, Japan has a word for death by overwork, and there's a reason for that, and that is an ongoing and deep scandal here in Japan that the Japanese try to sweep under the rug, but may not be able to do so if they continue pressing workers that hard in the preparation for the Olympics.
What is that word?
The word is karoshi, and again, it literally means death from overwork. It came into use in the 1970s, and it has unfortunately been a trending word ever since. And although there have been numerous government initiatives and things to try to deal with this problem, and we have heard talk from the Abe administration about changing Japan's work culture, but it has been largely talk. And unfortunately, there are a number of firms here that still continue to expect basically ownership of their employees to the point where they can force them into working dozens, hundreds of hours of overtime a month, often without any extra pay.
I watched a documentary. It was about two women who worked in department stores in Tokyo, and the big part of their discussion, they worked 6 in the morning till 6 at night, is what would they do on their one day off that month? Is that a common discussion?
A very real story, yes. And I myself have known people who are in that situation here in Japan. It is unfortunately not completely uncommon. And although there may be the idea of wealth here in Japan being formerly the second, now the third largest economy in the world, and obviously enjoying high living standards, but I think the phenomenon of working poor in Japan is a growing and increasing phenomenon that we've seen over the past couple of decades since the popping of the 80s bubble, and it looks like things are not really improving for the average worker here.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after this.
Aven Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Aven's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avenresources.com.
Keep informed. Receive our weekly recap of thought-provoking articles, podcasts, and radio delivered to your inbox for free. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage, HowStreet.com. Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett in Japan. James, the Chinese National Congress is going to huddle up next week. This is a pretty important meeting, isn't it?
It certainly is. This is the National Congress of the Communist Party of China. They meet twice a year, and twice in a decade. And this is a pretty large event, and there will be numerous government programs and things that are revealed as a result of this. The last one, obviously, we saw back in 2012, and a lot of build-up surrounding that, and a lot of ramifications potentially for global economic growth generally, given that global economic growth in recent years has been so largely predicated on the Chinese manufacturing base. And so government programs and changes and initiatives could certainly affect that. And probably the most important and pressing issue is the idea of credit creation within China itself. And the Chinese government has been easing off on that credit creation, which has been the kind of backbone of economic growth in China for the last several years. And so the question of whether they will be cutting their credit creation and how that might affect their global ratings from S&P and others, whether the Chinese credit rating will continue to be cut or whether it will maintain. These are questions that will ultimately filter out into the greater economy in China and then obviously throughout the world.
Is China continuing their crackdown on cyber currencies?
They are. They are talking about perhaps opening up some sort of exchanges, but of course they will be completely regulated. So the question is whether or not that really represents what Bitcoin is at all at that point. At any rate, there is now talk of, or increasing talk. There's been talk for a couple of years now, but increasing talk of the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, actually rolling out their own quote-unquote cryptocurrency, really just a digital currency, that will have really none of the defining features of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, which is at least pseudonymous and can circumvent various attempts at surveillance. But obviously the Chinese central bank version will be simply a digital form of currency that will be completely trackable, in which all transactions will be monitored by the government. So a wet dream, I suppose, for the Chinese regulators, not so much for Chinese citizens, which is why we've seen a startling rise in peer-to-peer transactions in cryptocurrencies in China. You can regulate or you can take down the exchanges, but that doesn't mean that people can't find a way to directly exchange with each other. And apparently that's what's going on more and more online now. People are basically just finding ways to trade directly with each other.
And it's nearly impossible to regulate the internet, although China employs, 5 million people to do that?
Yes, they have a very large segment of the government that is about surveilling, tracking, controlling, otherwise regulating the tech industry in particular. And in fact, right now, there's a big push going on for some of the largest tech companies in China, Tencent, Weibo, these types of companies that are very, very, very large and have large numbers of users. The Chinese government is apparently pressing to these companies to offer a stake to the government, a financial stake in them, and to let them have a role in corporate decisions. So I think China has always been the silent partner behind any large firm in China, but it's becoming even more blatant at this point, specifically in the tech sector.
The U.S. dollar right now is what most people trade oil in. Is the Chinese government trying to change that?
Short answer is yes, and we are seeing more indications of that, specifically as it turns to, for example, the Saudi-Chinese trading relationship, which is extremely important because China has become Saudi Arabia's largest customer for its oil. And Saudi, of course, has been, since the 1970s and the formation of the petrodollar, has been pricing its oil in U.S. dollars and recycling those dollars through the U.S. banking system in the form of U.S. treasuries. That could change, given the types of changes that we've seen in China's trading relationships and the fact that China has been pressing for more bilateral exchanges valued in yuan, and the fact that they are now offering oil futures priced denominated in yuan directly. And I think that is going to affect all of their trading relationships, including the Russia-China relationship and the Saudi-China relationship. So it is very likely that we are going to see in the coming years, I don't think this will be an overnight process, but in the coming years we will see the chipping away of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve, the standard by which all transactions, including oil transactions, are denominated.
What's the feeling in Japan right now with the war of words between Donald Trump and the North Korean leadership?
Well, it's even ratcheting up yet again as we're recording this conversation. It seems that there's been even more words of warfare. In fact, Trump has just said that North Korea has lit the wick of war and is now threatening a hail of fire. So the rhetoric certainly isn't toning down. The only thing that we can hope for at this point for the safety of people in the region is that this is just rhetoric and posturing. But obviously it's a huge concern here because obviously Japan is more on the front line than the United States is itself. And there are reports that Kim Jong-un is preparing a short-range missile test next week, which, given what we've seen in recent weeks and months, very much could be right over our heads here in Japan yet again. And the real question is, at what point is there a breaking point to this? I don't think you can go around continuing to say that the country has lit the wick of war and threatening a hail of fire and then continue to do nothing. So it really is just a question of when and how and if this gets set off, and if there's any way to step back from this diplomatic edge.
What about North Korea's talk of holding a hydrogen bomb test somewhere in the Pacific, considering they don't have any islands out there of their own to do it on?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I mean, obviously that would be an escalation that is hard to even conceive, and one can't imagine that could simply be ignored or continue status quo after a test like that happens. Again, it remains to be seen what that means, because as we've talked about before, there is no real pat military solution to this, because there is the hardwired-in artillery that is ready to strike South Korea at a moment's notice. There's no way for a military strike to occur on North Korea without some sort of blowback, and potentially millions of people in South Korea being affected. So it is not an easy problem to solve, and I think everyone in the region is treating it very seriously.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for having me on.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com. He was speaking to us from Japan. If you have any questions for James or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.